وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين.
Anyway, what I've been doing so far is, first of all, to trace the story of this great process of cultural transmission from the point of view of the Muslim world, and I've just begun to explain it from the point of view of the receiving end, namely medieval Europe. And I talked a little bit about the introduction of mathematics via this man Fibonacci, and also some other aspects of science. What I want to do now is to talk about astronomy. Mathematics traditionally one of the handmaids of astronomy. They tend to go side by side. And the pioneer here was a Spanish Jew who was brought up in a largely Muslim environment and who, upon his baptism, took the name of Petrus Alfonsi. Now, he's significant in more than one way. He wrote a book called the Disciplina Clericalis. I won't write it up because it's not immediately relevant. But the Disciplina Clericalis is essentially a collection of stories and anecdotes which were current in Muslim Spain. Some of them clearly have antecedents in things like the Arabian Nights. And this book was widely circulated in Latin in medieval Europe, and it's thought that Boccaccio, the author of the famous Decameron, took many of his often quite ribald stories from this book. And you can even find some considerable influence of this book, the Disciplina Clericalis, through two or three intermediaries in Grimm's fairy tales. Now, Petrus Alfonsi was also interested in astronomy. He fetches up in England at the court of Henry I, and he starts to communicate at least the elements of Islamic astronomy to a monk at the court. And this monk, whose name doesn't seem to have been preserved, himself started a school of astronomical learning for the first time in England, and the most distinguished exponent of this school was the great Robert Grosseteste. Grosseteste, distinguished as the first great Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford. Again, there are rumours that Grosseteste travelled in southern Spain. Certainly some of his predecessors, like Abdul of Bath, had done. It's conceivable that Bacon was down there. But scholars are increasingly recognising that some of the fundamental institutions and traditions of European institutions of higher learning actually have themselves Islamic antecedents. It's generally accepted, for instance, that the institution of a professorial chair, which was introduced particularly by people like Grosseteste, originates in the kind of low chair that the sheikh would sit with his back up against a column in places like the Mosque of Cordoba. So a chair became the symbol of professorial authority. There are also, it seems, Islamic antecedents in certain aspects of academic formal dress, gowns, mortarboards, etc. You can never definitively prove influence like that because it was a process of informal cultural transmigration, not the kind of thing that would necessarily be recorded in documents. Now, Grosseteste, who died in 1253, starts to lecture in Oxford on astronomy in particular, and he writes a few books both on astronomy and the associated mathematical problems. To some extent he's drawing on translations made directly into Latin from the Greek, but it's also recognized that he used for most of his sources Latin translations of the great Arabic works of which I spoke earlier. Grosseteste was also interested in medicine, which is the next great discipline we have to look at. And as I mentioned earlier, medicine in this period was at a disastrously low ebb in Europe. There's an indication of this in an anecdote narrated by a Syrian knight who participated in the Crusades, a certain Osama ibn Munqidh, who also worked as a physician. And he said that he once encountered a Frankish knight who had an abscess in his leg, and so Osama goes in and he knows what Razi and Ibn Sina have prescribed for this, which is a kind of herbal poultice, and he slaps it on. And then in comes a Frankish doctor, and the Frankish doctor takes one look at this and says, do you want to live with one leg or do you want to die with two? Of course, the poor knight says, well, I'll live with one leg. And without further ado, the Frankish doctor pulls out a sword and starts bashing away at the leg until he's removed it. Of course, the man dies from loss of blood pretty promptly. And this is, whether the story is true or not, it indicates what was a very real and huge disparity in the standard of medical practice between the two cultures. And the Crusaders certainly recognized this, and increasingly, once they'd been in Palestine for some time, they would make sure that they went to Muslim or Jewish doctors rather than to their compatriots. I mentioned a little bit earlier about hospitals in Europe, and that really they didn't exist as such in this period. The most that you would find would be dispensaries and clinics attached to some of the monasteries, particularly the Benedictine houses, Salerno and also Montpellier. Montpellier becomes a kind of nucleus for the transmission of medical science and hospital practice to Europe because, for various reasons connected to its commercial importance, it was a centre for the settlement of Jews and also Arab Christians from Spain. So it becomes a bridge. But this all takes place against a kind of social prejudice against doctors and particularly against surgeons. The surgeon was regarded as a man as a very low social standing, a kind of like a barber, somebody who dealt with other people's flesh. And as late as 1163 we find an ecclesiastical decree forbidding instruction in surgery as part of the medical curriculum. However, once translated books of Arabic surgery start to circulate quite freely in Europe, this attitude starts to change. Another factor in this change was, of course, the Crusaders coming back from Palestine, who had their own experience of the Saracen skill in surgery. So in 1252 we find the first significant European work on surgery. A man called Bruno da Longoburgo who writes a manual of surgery called the Chirurgica Magna. And this is basically just a translation of snippets from the great Arabic works, particularly the work of Zahrawi, the writer on surgery from Cordoba, who's the picture of whose instruments we've just been looking at. He's the principal source for this book on surgery. And it's also thought that the first, as it were, dedicated hospitals in Europe come into being following the Crusades. From about 1200 onwards, we don't have an exact date for the foundation of Europe's first hospital, but from about this period we start to find institutions established whose sole purpose was to heal the sick, rather than being wards or clinics attached to other larger institutions such as monasteries. However, still the standard of organisation and also the scale of these operations fell considerably below the standard in the Islamic world. So that, for instance, Europe's first hospital with a resident physician was not established until the year 1500. Remember, I mentioned this place called Al-Mansouri in Cairo, which had several resident physicians, which was not at all unusual at that time. Another Arab practice, clinical instruction in hospitals, so that students would actually see the sick and learn, as it were, on the job rather than learning in an abstract lecture hall environment. This was a tradition that the Arabs had maintained for several centuries. It was not copied in Europe until the year 1550. Again, the publication of medical textbooks offers another proof of the almost complete reliance of medieval European doctors on the Arab science. First book on medicine ever to be published in Europe was a commentary on the 9th book of Razi's great thing, the Continens, Al-Hawi. But the most significant publishing event in the medical world was the publication in 1473 of the great Canon of Avicenna, a book which it's realistically claimed is the most studied book of medicine in history. There was some reliance in Europe on Greek medicine, texts translated directly, Hippocrates, Galen, Dioscorides, and so forth. But the great preponderance of Arab influence is revealed by the fact that in the works of the leading medical physician of Italy, a certain Ferraro de Grado, we find, and some busy academic has actually totted up this and quantified it, that in his books the works of Avicenna are mentioned more than 3,000 times, while Hippocrates appears over 100 times. So that's some quantifiable evidence of the weight of authority that the medievals attached to the Arab as opposed to the Greek medical heritage. That's really all I think I should say about medicine. What I want to do now is to turn to what is perhaps an even more fundamental instance of this process of cultural transmission, namely philosophy. Medieval Europe, as just about everybody knows, owes a great debt to Arab philosophy, not just the philosophy of the ancients transmitted through Arabic translations into the West, but also original works written by Arab Muslims themselves. In a previous lecture, I already have sketched the development of this thing called the Kalam, which is Islamic dialectical theology, and I indicated that this drew often in quite a considerable, substantial way on things like Aristotelian logic, for instance, and also some discussions of metaphysical questions, the nature of atoms, causality and so forth, which had precedence in Greek thought and which were found to be useful. However, as well as this thing called the Kalam, there existed something a good deal more contentious called the Falsafa. Looks like an Arabic word, but doesn't require great ingenuity to see that this is just an Arabization of the Greek word that means philosophy. The Arabs called it Falsafa. This is a tradition that grew up side by side with Kalam, but the Kalam scholars and the people of Falsafa regarded each other with a certain amount of disdain. The Kalam scholars didn't like the Falasifa very much because they seemed to place too much emphasis on the authoritative ancient Greek texts and marginalized the Qur'an and the Hadith. Whereas the Falasifa were very confident in the capacity of reason, more or less unaided, to reach and determine ultimate truths, and saw the Kalam people as being people who were intellectually rather hobbled by their insistence on bringing in quotations, proof texts from the Islamic scriptures. So these two traditions existed in a state of considerable tension. Nonetheless, there was mutual influence. You can see in the Falsafa of Ibn Sina, the same chap who produced this book called the Canon, also the greatest Muslim medieval philosopher, that he draws on things from Islamic theology, particularly Ash'arism, and he also draws on some other teachings that were coming up in the, to some extent, Neoplatonized mystical tradition of Islam. He also had mystical writings. So there wasn't a kind of clear-cut dividing line between these two traditions. Nonetheless, they did exist in a state of tension in Islam. The first great Arab philosopher was a man called Al-Kindi. Some of his books have been preserved. His influence on medieval Europe was relatively slight compared to his successors. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, was really the great figure, whose book Ash-Shifa, which means the healing, i.e. the way of satisfying those pressing questions, was translated in large part into Latin in due course. There was also a man called Ibn Rushd, the third of the great Arabic philosophers, Ibn Rushd Averroes, who was the Maliki chief judge of Qurtuba, but who also in his spare time, as it were, was very influenced by yeah. There's also a man who I can include called Al-Farabi, who was quite influential in Europe. Farabi was a Turk from Central Asia who was a fairly thoroughgoing Platonist. Wrote a book called Al-Madina al-Fadila, the virtuous city, which is a kind of restatement in broadly Islamic terms of Plato's idea of the virtuous city. Ibn Rushd, as I was saying, Maliki Qadi, chief judge of Cordoba, and a great Aristotle fan. Farabi and Ibn Sina in particular were more interested in Neoplatonic things. Ibn Rushd tried to combine the two, but generally came down on the side of the Aristotelian point of view. So what was happening again over the frontier in Europe? How did this tradition migrate? Well, the first great Catholic theologian of the Middle Ages was Anselm. And Anselm's a pretty original thinker. Much of what he says is actually off his own bat, based on his own intelligent pondering of Scripture. But he also, we know, had access to some Greek texts in Latin translation that had been preserved by people like Boethius a couple of centuries earlier. Anselm is important as the person who set the stage for the introduction later on of the Arab philosophy. He created a foundation for the later successful creation of a Western Christian philosophical system, something which had not been attempted in the West previously. However, he himself, nor his immediate successor, a certain Peter Abelard, really could claim to have cracked the problem of how to present all of the details of the Christian faith in a philosophically coherent fashion. They simply use some of the more elementary tools of Greek dialectical reasoning to illuminate already established truths. So we find by the beginning of the 12th century there still was no overarching, sophisticated Christian philosophy which could express or defend Christian faith. When the Arab text started to be translated, there was a well-established tradition by this time in the colleges of Europe of dividing all of knowledge which was imparted into 7 different sciences. May as well write this up. Divided into 2 broader categories known as the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium included grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then, usually for more advanced students, something called the quadrivium syllabus, which was this basically was the syllabus in these early medieval schools. Now you'll notice that there's little room here really for the study of philosophy or philosophical theology. No room similarly, it seems, for the objective rationalizing study of ethics, or in fact for several other more abstract issues that had occupied the Greeks. The situation only changed when we find translations from Arabic coming along. And these translations, the most important of these translations were those made by this Segovia priest, Domenico Giundisalvi, whom I mentioned a while back. And it was Giundisalvi really who not only translated these texts, but popularized them and made them comprehensible to people who had been formed by this rather limited syllabus. So he wrote his own little books which summed up the Arabic knowledge. He wrote a book called On the Immortality of the Soul, for instance, which is entirely derived from Ibn Sina and which proved immensely popular. Even more influential in the longer term was his translation of a key book by Al-Ghazali, known in Arabic as Maqasid al-Falasifa. One of the most frequently studied philosophical texts in medieval Europe. Less important actually in the Islamic world, and the story of its transmission is a rather strange one, because Ghazali himself was a bitter enemy of the Falasifa. In particular, the philosophy of Ibn Sina, he held to be unduly rationalistic and too indifferent to truths received in revelation. Ghazali wrote a book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is regarded as the great intellectual monument of classical Islam, really. It's certainly one of the most difficult books in the literature. There is an English translation, if you're interested in looking at it. And he said, yes, we're very happy to acknowledge aspects of the Greek intellectual heritage in areas which do not directly clash with the truths of the Muslim religion. So we can adopt, for instance, Aristotelian ethics, more or less wholesale. The doctrine of the mean, virtue as being the mean that lies between two extremes, seems to be perfectly acceptable in the Quranic framework. And so he wrote books on essentially Aristotelian ethics, but giving examples from, say, the lives of the Muslim saints to illustrate these principles. So he wasn't a kind of crude, as it were, fundamentalist who said anything that comes from abroad is beyond the pale. He adopted a much more sophisticated approach. His attack on the Greek heritage was really limited to a fairly small number of metaphysical points, which he pointed out were simply incompatible with Muslim belief. And in this book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, I should put it beneath this. Might be more useful if I just give you the English translation, but you remember it means the incoherence of the philosophers. What he does in this book is to recognize that these stubborn philosophical types only accept rational arguments, and that you can quote the Qur'an at them until you're blue in the face, but they're not going to be moved by that. And so he, very unusually and courageously for an Orthodox Muslim scholar, decided to use rational tools in order to show the internal contradictions of the Ibn Sina Neoplatonizing worldview. And the book is in 20 chapters, each of them pointing out a flaw, an internal contradiction in the Ibn Sina worldview. And he says that on 17 of these issues, the Falasifa must be declared more or less heretical, although still within the pale of Islam. But on 3 of them, they have to be considered non-Muslims. He actually anathematizes them. And those 3 famous issues are, first of all, Ibn Sina follows an emanationist view of the emergence of the world from nothingness. He doesn't accept that the world was created ex nihilo. He thinks it's coming into being constantly, which was the Neoplatonic view. This conflicts with the Quranic view, therefore he can't really consider himself a Muslim. Similarly, and for more complex reasons, Ibn Sina had apparently denied what's called God's knowledge of particulars. He said that God is so great and perfect that he would be demeaned if he knew about all the tiny little trivial things that happen in this world. He just knows the bigger significant events. And Ghazali says, we have Quranic verses saying that not a leaf falls from a tree but that God knows it. Therefore, Ibn Sina cannot be considered a Muslim. And the third great issue was that of the eternity of the world. Ibn Sina, again because of the logic implicit in his emanationist view of the world as a necessary emanation from God, said that there would be no final winding up of the whole show. The world was going to go on forever. And Ghazali comes up with some very interesting ways of arguing against this. For instance, he says that it's incoherent to believe in the eternity of the world even on the emanationist theme, because the emanationists assumed that there was an accumulation of objects in the world. Things are coming into existence in this sublunary sphere. And yet, Plotinus also says the sublunary sphere is finite, and hence we have a contradiction. How can you have an infinite accumulation of objects which each take up a finite, discrete space in a finite sphere? He says the world is going to fill up, therefore the emanationist theory makes no sense. So that's an example of the kind of argument he's using. He's not just quoting the Qur'an at them, he's showing how their own system is incoherent and doesn't add up. So this is a key debate in medieval Islam. And I mention it because one of the interesting things Ghazali does is because he's really dedicated not just to firing off a polemic or to show off before his pious colleagues, but he really wants to refute them, is that he is very careful to ensure that he does not misrepresent their doctrines. If he does that, they can just say, well, that's not what we're saying anyway. Yep.
I was wondering, does he comment at all on Plato's concept of the cave, Platonism's approach to the created world manifest?
He uses the cave, and it's quite a common idiom in Muslim mystical writing, but as an illustration of the mystical topos, that what we see around us we take to be real, but we have no rational proof that there isn't a greater reality that lies behind it. That's the way he deploys it.
Conceptual structure as possible?
Yeah, Ghazali is a mystic, yeah, and many of his greatest works are precisely about the transience and the illusory nature of this world. Yeah, but he doesn't put it in this book because it's not relevant to his rather severe metaphysical concerns here. So Ghazali is interested in presenting very fairly the views of his adversaries. And to do this, he sums them up in this book, which is a kind of preface to the Tahafut. And Maqasid al-Falasifa means the intentions of the philosophers. And he sums up their views, particularly the system of Ibn Sina, with very great brilliance. And the philosophers themselves acknowledge that this is a fair summation of their views. And what happens when the transmission to Europe becomes almost a torrent in the 12th and 13th century is that this book, although it's occasionally referred to, doesn't seem to have been widely read. Whereas this book, which is just the prologue to it, the overture, becomes extraordinarily popular. It's translated into Latin and everybody's reading it. And so Ghazali, for the medieval European, becomes a kind of Ibn Sinian philosopher. They don't realize that he's merely setting up this as a target in order subsequently to knock it down. And this book, Maqasid al-Falasifa, becomes the classic short manual. It's about 300 pages of the Neoplatonic synthesis as advanced by Ibn Sina. So Aquinas, for instance, when he quotes from Al-Ghazal, which is his way of referring to Al-Ghazali, is usually talking about this work, and he assumes that Ghazali was a kind of Aristotelian Neoplatonic skeptic rather than a Muslim theologian. So that book is translated. I mentioned that Ibn Sina's book, the Shifa, is also translated. The Arabic Shifa becomes the Sufficientia in Latin. So when we find Thomas Aquinas creating this thoroughly brilliant intellectual summation of scholastic learning, Thomas Aquinas draws particularly on Ibn Sina, especially this work, the Sufficientia. He draws on the Maqasid al-Falasifa of Ghazali, but he also draws on this man, Ibn Rushd, known to the West as Averroes. Sometimes, to be pretentious, you can put an umlaut on that. You find that in some old texts. Averroes, as I said, is the chap who resurrects Aristotle in a largely Platonizing tradition. And one of the strange things that Averroes did, and I've no idea how he found time to do it because he was a busy court judge and wrote many books, or several books on Islamic law, was that he took the main works on metaphysics of Aristotle, which are themselves very hermetic, difficult pieces of work, and on each of them he writes 3 commentaries. He writes a lesser commentary, which is short, about the same length as the original, a middle commentary, which is a bit more serious, and then a large commentary. And most of these are done pretty rapidly into Latin, in fact even before Averroes dies in 1198. Averroism is in particular taken up by the Dominicans. The Dominicans have, before the emergence of the Jesuits, they're the great torchbearers of Christian intellectualism. Albertus Magnus died in 1280, was quite deeply influenced by Averroes' commentaries. Aquinas himself, obviously also a Dominican. So we find in Aquinas what is in essence a synthetic theology that very intelligently fuses Plato and Aristotle, largely mediated via the Arabs, also the Islamic philosophical tradition, Ghazali and some other figures, and biblical data, in order to form this great coherent Christian system whose influence really continues even in the present day. In the first decades of the present century, there was a great revival of Thomist philosophy. Thomism is the philosophical system associated with St. Thomas. So a lot of 20th century Catholic thinkers like Étienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain have attempted to show the abiding relevance and interest of St. Thomas's ideas. The other pupils, as it were, of Ibn Rushd in Europe were the so-called Latin Averroists. And unlike Aquinas, who, rather like Ghazali, was concerned to show the proper relationship between reason and revelation, that they had a symbiotic rather than a necessarily conflictual relationship, that the Latin Averroists really erred on the side of rationality. And they picked up an idea that Ibn Rushd had developed and that provoked considerable controversy in the Islamic world, which is known as the theory of the double truth. How on earth can we reconcile these apparent conflicts between the conclusions of logic as developed through philosophy on the one hand and the clear requirements of belief as set forth in revelation? And Ghazali, as I indicated, said that you have to push the philosophers to one side on a number of issues where they clearly conflict with revelation. Revelation is infallible, the mind is not. The Latin Averroists, on the other hand, went even further than Ibn Rushd had done with this idea of the double truth. And they took it to mean that two contradictory propositions can both be true. That the epistemological register of revelation is something that's in a completely different category to that of reason. Therefore, you can simultaneously say the world has always existed as an emanation from the Godhead, and you can say the world came into existence in time. And they have a fairly sophisticated way of showing how those two can somehow be reconciled. There are books by Ibn Rushd, by the way, which have been done into English, if you want to see exactly how he thinks he can achieve this. The greatest Latin Averroist was Belgian. See, it's not true that Agatha Christie's Detective Poirot was the only famous Belgian there's been in history. Apologies to Abdul for that one. He was a Belgian scholar who was the great Averroes, and actually Siga of Brabant and also the Italian school, the Padua Averroists, got into very hot water with the church, as you can imagine, and the school eventually died away. Side by side with this, you find translations of text on logic. Bits of Aristotle's Organon, it seems, had already been known, perhaps through the medium of Byzantine scholars. So bits of it were done directly from the Greek, but the majority of Aristotle's work on logic was made available in its complete form for the first time only with the Arabic translations. And it's worth remarking, by the way, and probably I should have done this somewhat earlier, that Arabic showed itself to be a very supple linguistic vehicle for the conveyance of these ideas. It started off as the language of an extremely non-intellectual people, primitive tribesmen wandering in the desert, etc. But within 150 or 200 years, we find these great translations appearing in the Arabic language, and the language actually holds up very well. If you look at Hunayn bin Ishaq's version of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, it's actually quite brilliant. It's regarded as a translation no less accurate than are the modern English translations of the Nicomachean Ethics. This again was one thing that made this cultural efflorescence possible, the extraordinary flexibility and suppleness of the Arabic language. I said I wanted to leave time for questions. Maybe the most sensible thing is if I ask you if you've got a lot of questions, or whether I should press on. Hands up if you've got a question. not a huge number. I've obviously convinced you utterly, so, or baffled you utterly. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the political ramifications of the contest between Christendom and Islam. The title of this lecture is Islam and the West, however one interprets that. And I wanted to say a little bit about the changing relationship which has happened between these two great cultural zones. For 4 centuries, as I indicated, Christendom was really completely on the defensive, reeling from the shock of this completely inexplicable, certainly theologically inexplicable, triumph of this new religion that had popped up from nowhere. And the only area really where territory was retaken by Christianity from Islam was the very northern fringes of Spain. Of all of the areas overrun by the companions of the Prophet and their pupils, Spain is the only area that has since been lost to the world of Islam. So we find in northern Spain, the kingdom of Asturias is established, the first independent Christian state in Spain following the Arab conquest. And this was the work of Alfonso I, died in 757. Followed by the end of the next century with the establishment of the Kingdom of Leon. This is happening, as it were, at the top left-hand corner of Spain. Something is happening also in southern France, much of which has been under Muslim rule. So we find the city of Narbonne returning to Christian hands in 751. And this little nibbling at the edges, very insignificant in terms of the whole of the world of Islam, started to convince Christians that the Muslims were not invincible, and that perhaps some kind of ideology of Christian revanchism, of the pushing back of the frontiers of this strange new phenomenon was possible. And much of the development of early European literature cannot be understood except against this cultural background. The most obvious and frequently cited case of this is the great Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, which was composed, it seems, sometime in the 10th or the 11th century, but which relates to Charlemagne's ill-fated expedition to the then Muslim city of Saragossa in 778. And this chanson, in various versions, remained right at the center of the European literary canon for some time, in fact well into the Renaissance. And its ethos really explains to us the twofold European response to the world of Islam. On the one hand, the absolute hatred of it as a rival or heretical religion, and on the other hand, the kind of admiration and envy of an enormously successful, prosperous, more populous, more economically and scientifically and intellectually advanced civilization. So you have this kind of almost schizophrenia in the early medieval European mind. And it's paralleled in some ways by what's happening today in the Muslim world, where you see a lot of Muslims equivalently horrified by the triumph of the West. How are Muslims to understand this thing? It's really no less bewildering than what happened to medieval Christendom. The West was supposed to have been definitively overcome. Christianity is an older religion, the newer religion has come, and how come these people have bounced back again after the Renaissance? It's a real puzzle for the Muslim mind. So you find this dislike of the West as this rival, highly successful ideology. And at the same time, you find amongst a lot of Muslims a kind of admiration or envy for the West's administrative, military, scientific prowess. So there's a kind of interesting mirror image there. And this Chanson de Roland very much indicates this Western European attitude. And we find in it the beginnings of what was to become the Western take on Islam. We find, for instance, in the chanson that Charlemagne defied Mahound, their word for the prophet, and Apollon, Jupiter, Ascaroth, and Alcoran. And it seems that the authors of the Chanson de Roland believed that the Muslims were idol worshippers and that these were 5 of their idols. And there's a passage in some versions of the song where we find in the great mosque in Valencia, there's a huge golden idol which has 2 ruby eyes. So we find a militancy in the Chanson de Roland, but significantly it's still a tale of Christian defeat. The story is when the Muslims attacked the baggage train of Charlemagne's army as he was retreating across the Pyrenees and inflicted a defeat on the Christians. So it's a kind of rather wistful, ironic kind of thing for Europeans to be singing about. They're kind of celebrating something but also commemorating a Christian defeat. And if you look at the Chanson de Roland, you'll find that it's not a terribly religious document. And the fact that later on wars between Christians and Muslims took on a very bitterly theological and polemical dimensions should not obscure the fact that in the earlier period, wars between Muslims and Christians were really almost ad hoc things and were scarcely more significant than were wars between Christians or between Muslims. In Spain, there was a very powerful later ideology of holy war against Muslims, bringing in St. James as the strange archetypal warrior for the cross against the wicked Moors. But this is a later thing, and earlier generations of Christians in Spain didn't see that they had to regard Muslims in that light. Rather different in orientation was the other great formative adventure, or counterattack, if you like, of Christendom against Islam, namely the Crusades. And although I don't wish to turn this into a history lecture, no account of the mutual link between Islam and the West and mutual attitudes will be complete without at least mentioning the Crusades. The Crusades are different because whereas the Reconquista begins in a fairly secular key and only later becomes religiously ideologized and justified, the Crusades start out as a religious enterprise and later develop a secular dimension. The idea of fighting for the Christian faith probably goes back at least as far as the Emperor Constantine. It's very emphatically alien to the spirit of the New Testament, but Constantine and to some extent also Augustine were happy to develop Christian theories of a just war, the idea that the Christian could take up arms in defense of the faith. So we find, for instance, in the middle of the Dark Ages, somebody called Agobard, who's from Lyon, writing that the subjugation of barbarous nations so that they may embrace the faith and widen the frontiers of the kingdom of the faithful is to be recommended. Hence we find that the popes increasingly, when they invest the emperors with the symbols of office, give them a sword as well. Another quote from the same period, a certain Brun of Querfort, actually one of the leading monastic reformers of the 10th century, taught that a Christian king's duty was to compel heathens to come in by the sword. And we find a lot of cases of this, for instance, the Teutonic Knights as they pushed the frontiers of Christendom into Poland and the Baltic states, essentially offering people the choice of baptism and the sword. The conversion of the Norwegians, another example of this. They could either convert to Christianity or they would have their hands and their feet cut off. That was how the northern Norwegians became Christians. Again, utterly alien to the spirit of the Gospels, but more or less normative in the early medieval period. And it's this strand of thought that really forms the mental backdrop to the idea of the crusade. For centuries, Christians have been making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, and by and large, it's fair to say that they were not obstructed. Inevitably, there would be bandits and minor petty officials along the way who might harass them in the way that they might harass other people as well. But generally, it was possible for Christians to go. The idea of crusade ultimately was not to open the way for Christian pilgrimage, it was to recapture land that was rightfully Christian. And it took place not in this early period, the 3 first centuries of Christian reaction to Islam, but with the reforming popes of the 11th century. One priority of the popes of this period was to encourage greater central control of the principalities of Europe. And this, of course, required that they stop fighting against each other. And a good way of doing this, of course, was to set up an external enemy, namely the world of Islam. Get them all together, different nations, different principalities, dynasties, fighting against a common enemy, and you'll pull Europe together much more easily. So the papacy starts to encourage this mood by, for instance, beginning in the 11th century to declare indulgences for those who fought against the Saracens in Spain. So we start to find knights from France, for instance, coming into Spain to take part in the Reconquista. We also find in the same century the Pope giving war banners to expeditions against the Muslims of Sicily and an ill-fated expedition against Tunisia. He would also give similar banners to campaigns against the schismatic Byzantines. So against this very new atmosphere in Christendom, we find in 1095 Pope Urban II making his famous speech at the city of Clermont, urging the assembled representatives of Christendom to launch a war against the Muslims of the East. And thus is born an event which is certainly the single most formative event, not so much in the history of the Middle East, because the Crusades really, in the longer term, left no noticeable consequences on the map, but in terms of the mutual perception of Christians and Muslims. The old, not so much a symbiotic relationship, but an ability to accommodate and deal with the other that had prevailed before the Crusades was now to be swept away. So the First Crusade fights its way to Palestine in 1099 and captures Jerusalem. And the fall of Jerusalem is an event of absolute horror. It's said that about 90,000 people, all of the non-Christian population, was immediately put to the sword. And this has left lasting scars in the region. So even today the word Salibi or Crusader is a very pejorative term in the Arabic language. And when people making mosque sermons, for instance, or political leaders in the Islamic world want to denounce Western interference in the world of Islam, they will refer to them as Crusaders. In the Western languages, of course, the word Crusader has fairly neutral or even positive connotations. You can have a crusade against crime or something like that, and it's regarded as a legitimate phrase to use. So this massacre is very horrible, and it has considerable ramifications for the regional mindset. So if I find a friar who is present at the massacre speaking of horses moving knee-deep in Saracen blood, and he declared enthusiastically, "It is a wonderful judgment of God." And even St. Bernard gave his support and writing, "A Christian glories in the death of a Saracen because Christ is glorified thereby." And the Crusaders go on to create little replicas of the European feudal societies they've left behind. Generally they're contemptuous of Muslim beliefs and religious practices, but as I indicated earlier, they came to be not averse to taking on some of the more secular, civilized, almost luxurious trappings of Middle Eastern life. So the Frankish enclave in Palestine becomes one channel for the movement of certain aspects of Islamic civilization into Europe, far less significant though than, say, the movement of translation or the Reconquista of Spain. The success of the Crusades was famously the result not so much of the strength of the Christian armies. The subsequent Crusades were generally complete catastrophes, but were made possible by Muslim disunity and the lack of a comparable religious militancy on the Muslim side. There was no Muslim ethos of counter-crusade for some time, until the great Kurdish general Saladin united Syria and Egypt under his rule and retook Jerusalem in 1187. It's important to recall that Saladin, when he entered the city, did not order an equivalent massacre. City's churches were left intact. And in fact, those who had survived from the non-Catholic churches there made it quite plain that they actually preferred Muslim rule to that of the rather less tolerant Latins. Comparable to the statement of Gennadios, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, when the city was in the process of falling, and they were offered support from Latin Christians. Their experience of Latin Christian intolerance had been so acute that he said famously, "Better the turban of the Turk than the mitre of Rome." And it was similar for the Eastern Christians, who were able to live in peace, not interfered with as they had been previously. Waves of further crusaders still turn up from Europe. Generally they're beaten off without much difficulty. And Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands as an inseparable part of the spiritual metabolism of the Muslim world until, of course, the creation of Israel takes place in 1948 to initiate a further and no less unnecessary episode of West-East incomprehension. One effect of the Crusades in Europe was to bring home to Europeans the continued strength of Islam. Subsequent Crusades operated on a different and more cautious strategy, recognizing that Palestine could only be held for Christendom if one adopted a more sober, larger policy towards the region as a whole. And so we find Crusaders aiming to subjugate not just Palestine, but surrounding countries. St. Louis's expedition to Egypt in 1249 is a good example of this. Another complete catastrophe in which these incredibly heavily armoured French knights more or less submerge in the marshes of the Nile Delta. They're completely annihilated. Crusades continue to be launched, though. They haven't learnt their lesson. St. Louis attacks Tunisia in 1270. In 1313, a Dominican called Guillaume Adam, who travelled a bit in the Muslim world, wrote a kind of manual of crusading by the name of De Modo Saracenos Extirpandi, on the way to exterminate Saracens, which laid even more ambitious plans for the invasion of Egypt in order to construct a Christian fleet in the Red Sea, which would sack Mecca and Medina and go on to attack the Muslim world from behind. And the justification for this in the theology by this time was quite simple. One didn't need any provocation to attack Muslims because they were, by their very existence on the earth, a provocation and a flagrant blasphemy against God. They were summa culpabilis. They were the sum of everything that is blameworthy, and hence it's the Christian knight's religious duty to try and extirpate them. As I said, the Crusades left very little impact on the map of the Near East, but they did have an effect on the shaping of Muslim attitudes towards these strange people who lay beyond the ocean. But their consequences for European history were far more considerable. You recall that I mentioned the Pirenne thesis earlier, that the conquests of the early Muslims started to make Christians think of Europe as some kind of coherent entity, something which had never been before in history. And the Crusades very much strengthened this image. And increasingly, the other, the demonic other, was identified with Islam and the world of Islam. So following the Crusades, we find a new type of European mentality emerging, one that is self-conscious and ideologically militant in its hostility to Muslims. Not just opportunistic border skirmishing, one monarch taking the land of another monarch who happens to be Muslim or whatever, but an ideologized split now emerging between Christendom and the world of Islam. And this idea of crusade also carried over into other larger campaigns. It's worth remembering that the Portuguese navigators saw themselves as crusaders and meted out to the various peoples, including non-Muslims that they encountered, the same kind of treatment that the Muslims had experienced in Palestine. Vasco da Gama and others generally would wear crusading outfits. They would take the Crusader cross and so forth. So this becomes really the defining event in the formation of the European mind. Historian Stephen Runciman says, through the Crusades, Europe found its soul. This perception continues even today. Only 3 years ago, the President of the European Union, Jacques Delors, made a speech in which he said that membership of the European Union is conditional on possessing a shared Christian heritage. And this is very clearly indicative of a mentality that has gone on for 800 years. Europeanness means Christianness, and the other, the barbarian, is what lies beyond. Many other things could be said about subsequent attitudes on both sides. One could talk, for instance, about the strange movement of self-inflicted martyrdom. So important was the conflict with Islam's scene that a number of Christians actually deliberately went to the Muslim world and courted martyrdom. The first instances of this happened in the 9th century, when we find a few monks and nuns deliberately going before Muslims and insulting the Prophet in the hope that they will be martyred. And this continues, so we find one of the greatest medieval Christian thinkers, Ramon Lull, who's a Catalan, who really devotes his life to refuting Islam in a philosophical way. Very bright man. He travels 3 times to what is now Algeria and goes to the Friday prayers and stands outside and shouts these words of abuse against the Prophet. And 3 times he's deported. The Muslims think this is some kind of nutcase, and they put him on the next ship back to Spain. The 4th time he goes to Tunis and he does the same thing and is actually killed by a mob. It seems incomprehensible to the modern mind, but this was actually quite common. And St. Francis of Assisi even did the same thing. He went to Egypt, appeared before the Sultan al-Adil. Sultan said, "Well, why have you come?" And he starts to vomit up these insults about the Qur'an and the Prophet. And he's also sent home. Indicative again of this incomprehension, I mentioned last time the 4 great reasons that Europeans had for rejecting Islam. Firstly, it's a falsehood and a perversion of the truth. It's a religion of violence and the sword. Particularly strange thing for people who are gearing themselves up for crusades to believe, but that was what they said. Thirdly, it's a religion of self-indulgence. Fourthly and finally, Muhammad is the Antichrist. I think probably that's a good place, if a rather depressing one, to stop the narrative. I did mention last time that the situation has changed utterly, not least because of the changes that have been going on in theological circles. No longer do mainstream Christians believe that the Prophet was the Antichrist. In fact, the most recent serious biography of the Prophet by Karen Armstrong, who's a well-known ex-Catholic nun, is actually so sympathetic to the Prophet that a Muslim organisation in England gave her a prize for it. Muslims actually like the book very much. So those old medieval attitudes have largely been superseded. They are, however, as such stereotypes and prejudices tend to do, lurking beneath the surface. And it's always possible to find small-minded evangelical groups, particularly in some of the southern states of the United States, resurrecting these old images. So just 2 months ago, tens of thousands of houses in the largely Muslim city of Bradford in England had a 64-page booklet abusing the Prophet pushed through their letterboxes, with information on how to contact something called Chick Publications in California in order to get more information. And there's a little form at the bottom. I've actually seen these things saying, "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal saviour?" Tick the little box. And then there's something like, "Thank you, God, for showing me what you think of Islam," etc., etc. And it's a pretty horrifying thing. And Muslims in England do recognise that this is something that is horrific and rejected by the mainstream churches. I mention it simply to remind us that this, in many ways, quite miserable epic of mutual incomprehension is still continuing, that there are still classical stereotypes of Islam as a religion of violence, the sword, martyrdom, etc., which are trotted out by journalists. And the enthusiasm with which journalists and other cheap cultural commentators will attribute Muslim political violence to Muslimness rather than to the objective causes of their violence. The idea being that somehow, even if Palestine hadn't been occupied by the Israelis, Hamas would still be in existence, there would still be terrorist bombs, etc. This is a very dangerous thing. The worst error one can make in contemplating somebody else's religious world and civilization is to judge the mainstream on the basis of the antics of the lunatic fringe. Unfortunately, this is all too common amongst our journalists in the West, and the consequences for it are potentially quite frightening. And I think it's fair to remark that the incomprehension is mutual, that there is a Muslim stereotype also of the Christian world and of the West, generated in large part not just by the memory of things like the Crusades, but also more recently by the journalistic propensity to focus on extreme, unpleasant, frightening manifestations which are newsworthy and ignoring the mainstream. So that, for instance, when the Waco siege was covered in the Arabic press, somehow people got the impression that this was some kind of typical mainstream messianic Christian event. The Moonies are also regarded as a very important Christian phenomenon. The bloodthirsty declarations of the Serbian bishops are taken as being normative rather than marginal. So it's a process of mutual incomprehension. And since this is my last lecture, perhaps I could close on the note that encounters such as this, while they might seem to be important and insignificant, actually can play a very fundamental and much needed role in overcoming this incomprehension, which is certainly one of the most frightening and urgent needs as we approach the new millennium. And my experience of you all has been that you are very open-minded, decent and concerned people. And it's my confidence that we will all work as hard as we can to overcome these prejudices, which have caused such misery and gratuitous warfare and suffering in the past, and which we must now definitively set behind us. A few minutes for questions, and then that's that. Yes?
I have a question that goes back to music.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the lute. I believe the lute is being Islamic instrument.
That's right.
What about the guitar?
The guitar also is from the Arabic ithara, which was a Spanish thing. Yeah. Inevitably, there's no definitive form of any of these instruments until very recent times, and it has demonstrable Arabic precedent. Yeah.
Is there any question about the concept of zero? I've read in several other places that zero was originally conceived of by Indians, Buddhists, perhaps Hindus, through the construct of being and nothingness, the void, and so forth. I was wondering if you could clarify that.
Short answer is that I don't know. I'm merely parroting the usual academic consensus, which is that it comes from the medieval Arab world. But very often you can find precedents further east. Like the invention of paper, for instance, which was taken up by the Islamic world, originally came from China. So it's possible that that came from further east.
So I tried to teach it as coming through the Arabic world, but from India.
Yeah, I have to look that up.
You mentioned the great caravans, as many as 60,000 at a time. How did they possibly supply themselves?
Well, good question. The Silk Route, you can still travel it today. There have been various people who've gone along it on four-wheel drive vehicles, and you'll see huge cisterns which they'd reach at the end of each day's travelling. They would travel just in the morning and then pitch camp. And they would be supplied with water. They would have means of supplying themselves with food along the way as well. But those caravans were not as logistically problematic as the great Hajj caravans, which go from places like Syria in particular. It's known definitively that some of those caravans were a lot larger, and it's said that as many as 1 million people would travel on the big Hajj caravans. If they travelled individually, it might be dangerous because there were bandits in the desert and so forth, so they tended to go in one, carry their food with them, yep. Yep. Yep.
I had a very practical question. You were talking about how some people were saying that all Christians are like the people in Waco, and you read that in the press.
Yep.
Can you tell us names that might, of newspapers that might have had that? Because that to me would be a great teaching tool to demonstrate that stereotypes go both ways. Right.
I saw it even in a fairly secular newspaper based in London called Al Hayat, which is a respected newspaper. And the rather sloppy journalists seem to imply that this is the kind of thing you expect, especially from American Christians. It's not just a flash in the pan, it's representative of very widespread possibility in Christianity. Al Hayat, AL-HAYAT. That's a place where I did see it, but I'm sure you'd find it in other publications as well. Maybe one should add as a footnote to that the stereotype is not entirely reciprocal, because Muslims generally have more experience of Christians than vice versa, because Christians have been around as substantial minorities, living and working amongst Muslims for so long, that your average Egyptian, when he reads that, will know that the Copt who is down the road or who's Minister of the Interior or whatever isn't like that. Whereas Westerners, for whom Muslims are often a very new phenomenon, are going to find it harder to sort out what's normative from what's extreme. Any more questions?
What was the size of the army of the Crusaders, and did they take women with them?
Yes, they took women basically for purposes of prostitution with them, not as families. Once they'd taken Jerusalem and Acre, then Frankish women would come from Europe. But very few aristocratic women actually set out with the Crusaders. And I think maybe somebody can correct me here, but the usual figure for the army is about 40,000, of whom about maybe less than half actually made it. Many of them died of various plagues along the way, or they were killed by raiders. But that, I think, have you? Yeah, I think it was about that. Yeah. And there's a series that's just been aired on British TV. I don't know if it's coming here, called The Crusades, narrated somewhat improbably by the famous Python figure Terry Jones. And he actually...
Just on PBS over
Yeah.
the last month.
Did anybody see it?
Yeah, saw some of it.
Yeah. I mean, he's very good at debunking the traditional sort of chivalric myth of the Crusaders. Points out that they were cannibals, that there were debates along the way amongst the friars who would say, if we eat children, is it better to eat Muslim children or Christian Orthodox children? And he shows them sort of roasting them on spits. They were pretty nasty characters.
If I might add to that, the whole notion of the Children's Crusades,
Yeah.
two crusades that take off with this popular sense of, getting children involved
Yeah.
in this
Yep.
as warriors.
And I think not one returned or something.
That's correct.
Vanished.
Lost in the Alps or something.
Or sold
Lost
into
in
slavery.
slavery.
Yeah, slavery, yeah.
No, it was clearly some kind of collective neurosis that gripped Europe, kind of McCarthyism of the 13th century. Anyone else? Okay, that's the last you're going to hear of from me. Thanks very much for your patience.